Welcome to Picture Mavericks, where every frame has a story. Today we are looking at a comedy sequel that tried to do something genuinely ambitious and only partially succeeded. Ted 2 was released in 2015, 3 years after the original film grossed over $549 million worldwide. The expectations that came with that success were considerable, and the conventional response to those expectations would have been to repeat what worked the first time with a slightly larger budget. Seth MacFarlane did not do that. Ted 2 is built around a premise that is structurally different from its predecessor, more legally and philosophically ambitious, and less emotionally consistent as a result. Understanding why the film works in some places and loses its way in others tells us something useful about the specific challenges of building a comedy sequel around an idea rather than around a situation. The first film used its fantasy premise to tell a story about avoidance and arrested development. Ted the character was a literalization of the thing keeping John Bennett from committing to his adult life. The emotional logic was clean, and the absurdist premise served it directly. Ted 2 shifts the central question entirely. The film opens with Ted marrying his girlfriend Tammy Lynn, and the story that follows is built around Ted's legal fight to be recognized as a person rather than as property. When the state of Massachusetts rules that Ted is not a legal person, he loses his job, his marriage is declared invalid, and he faces the possibility of being taken apart and studied as a corporate asset. That is a significant tonal escalation from the first film. The original asked whether John could grow up. The sequel asks whether a sentient being has the right to exist on its own terms. These are not the same kind of questions, and they do not generate the same kind of comedy. The legal and civil rights framework the film builds its story around is handled with more seriousness than the premise might suggest. MacFarlane draws explicit parallels between Ted's fight for personhood and historical civil rights struggles, and the film does not treat those parallels as purely comedic material. There are moments in the courtroom sequences where the argument being made is genuine, and the film expects the audience to engage with it as such. This is where Ted 2 is at its most interesting and also at its most uneven. A broad comedy built around a crude talking teddy bear is an unusual vehicle for a serious argument about legal identity and civil rights. The film is aware of that tension, and it attempts to use the contrast productively. Sometimes it succeeds. The absurdity of Ted having to prove his humanity in a courtroom does generate a specific kind of comedy that the first film could not have accessed. The gap between the seriousness of the legal proceedings and the nature of the plaintiff produces genuine comedic friction. But the film does not always manage the transition between its comedic register and its more serious one with consistency. There are sequences where the emotional stakes of Ted's situation feel real and consequential, and sequences in the same film where that weight is entirely absent. The tonal inconsistency is the film's central structural problem, and it is what prevents the sequel from landing with the same coherence as the original. Mark Wahlberg returns as John Bennett, and the film makes a significant change to his character's situation. John and Laurie are divorced at the start of the film, a development that is addressed briefly and then largely set aside. This is a notable decision because the emotional arc of the first film was built almost entirely around John and Laurie's relationship. Removing that relationship from the sequel also removes the emotional anchor that gave the first film its underlying seriousness. In its place, the film introduces a new character, a young lawyer named Samantha played by Amanda Seyfried, who takes on Ted's case and develops a relationship with John across the film. The dynamic between John and Samantha is handled competently, but it does not carry the same weight as the relationship it replaces. The audience has history with Laurie. Samantha is introduced as a plot function and develops into a character from there, which is a different thing. The choice to move on from Laurie without substantially engaging with what that means for John is one of the film's missed opportunities. The first film earned its emotional resolution. The sequel begins by discarding that resolution without fully accounting for it. Where Ted 2 is more consistent is in its comedy. MacFarlane's instinct for comedic escalation is well calibrated throughout, and several sequences in the film generate genuine, sustained laughter through the quality of their construction rather than simply through the novelty of their premise. The film has a confidence in its own comedic voice that sequels often lack, and there are moments where it is funnier than the original on a purely technical level. The relationship between Ted and John remains the film's most reliable source of comedy and warmth. Whatever structural problems exist around that relationship, the central dynamic between the two characters is consistent and the affection between them feels genuine. That consistency is what keeps the film watchable even in its less focused passages. The cultural context of Ted 2 is worth examining briefly. The film arrived at a moment when conversations about legal personhood, civil rights, and identity were unusually prominent in public discourse. Whether intentionally or not, the film positioned itself inside those conversations by making Ted's fight for recognition its central story. The critical response to that positioning was mixed. Some reviewers felt the film was using serious subject matter as a backdrop for comedy without earning the right to do so. Others felt the absurdist framing was precisely what made the argument accessible. Both positions have merit, and the film does not resolve the tension between them cleanly enough to settle the question. What is clear is that McFarlane was attempting something with Ted 2 that went beyond giving audiences more of what they enjoyed the first time. Whether that ambition was fully realized is a separate question from whether it was worth attempting, and on balance, it was worth attempting. A sequel that reaches and falls short is more interesting than a sequel that plays it safe and succeeds entirely on those terms. Ted 2 is an uneven film that is more ambitious than its reputation reflects. Its structural problems are real, and they prevent it from achieving the tonal consistency that made the original work as well as it did. But the ambition behind those problems is genuine, the comedy is frequently strong, and the central relationship at the heart of the film remains as watchable in the sequel as it was the first time. What the film ultimately reveals is something specific about comedy sequels built around an idea. The idea that drove the first film was emotionally precise and structurally contained. Replacing it with a larger and more complex idea required a different kind of film than Ted 2 was able to fully become. The gap between what the film was attempting and what it achieved is frustrating precisely because the attempt was the right instinct. That is not a small thing. Most sequels do not have the right instinct. Ted 2 did. It just could not always find the right execution to match it. That was Picture Mavericks. If this breakdown gave you a new way into the film, subscribe and stay with us. Every video is built around one idea: that the best stories reward the people who look closer. We will see you in the next frame.